My name is Roy Crompton. I'm the Director of the Energy Leadership Centre here at the Business School, and I'm going to be steering. First of all, just a few practical issues. If you have a portable device, we'd be grateful if you put it on silent. To the left and down the passage, and you come to some small rooms which have like pictures of men or women on the doors. That's the first protocol. If you get more excited than that, we've got paramedics in attendance. If you get too excited, we've got security officers in attendance who will help you to get excited outside the court. So the Energy Leadership Centre is trying to, and is equipping future leaders of energy with the skills and ideas to cope with the oncoming tsunami of technological change, economic change, and environmental change in the energy sector. So we offer a postgraduate diploma in energy leadership and a master's degree in energy leadership. It's taught on a block release system so that people can continue working. So you basically off 5 weeks over the year to one of those courses. Now let me introduce our panelists for tonight's discussion, which is about would deregulation lower petrol prices. On your right, in front of me here, is Collins Khumalo, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the AA, Automobile Association. He's previously been the CEO of Payment Solutions Africa. He also has worked at MultiChoice South Africa, having a number of various senior positions there, including Director of African Development, Managing Director of Nigeria, worked in Botswana, and been the Chief Operating Officer in South Africa. He has the BA Honours in Psychology and has attended the IMD Business School, a very famous business school. Next to him is Fani Chikalora, who's probably known to many of you as the Executive Director of SAPIA, the South African Petroleum Industry Association. Fani's been there quite a long time now. Let me just see, I think it's about 2004, if I remember. And he also participates in the Business Unity South Africa various activities. He has a master's degree in future studies. So he's going to tell us all about the future. And he's also worked at SARS, so he knows about the two certainties in life, death and tax. Next to him is Muzi Wiseman and Keys. We've got one wise man with us tonight. Muzi is the full-time regulator member responsible for petroleum pipelines at NERSA, that's the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. He is a chemical engineer by training, and has worked at Sasol Synfuels. We started his professional career. He's worked at the National Prosecuting Authority, so watch out. And he's also worked as the Department of Energy for quite a long time, where he was involved in policy, and he understands all of these things we're going to be discussing, where he was the Chief Director of Hydrocarbons at the Department of Energy. He's also been head of the Economic Development and Tourism at the Mpumalanga Provincial Government. He has a Master's of Business Leadership and a Bachelor of Commerce, as well as his engineering degree. He served on the boards of various state-owned enterprises. And on your extreme left is Ryan Hawthorne, who is an economist who works on competition and economic regulation issues. You may have noticed that some of the people here are not on the invitation that was circulated. Yesterday afternoon, 2 of the panelists withdrew suddenly at short notice. So I would like to extend our sincere appreciation to Muzi and Ryan in particular, who stepped in at short notice to fill those gaps. Ryan has worked on antitrust economics, telecommunications regulations. He's an associate of the Centre for Competition and Regulation and Economic Development, and he's been a senior economist at the Competition Commission. He's the founder of Johannesburg Economics, and now works at Acacia Economics. He has a master's degree in economics from Wits University. Welcome back, welcome home. And he also has BS Bachelor of Business Science from that little university on the peninsula somewhere. What's it called? Right, so here's how it works this evening. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to the initial question, and then I'm going to pose some questions to them, depending on what they say. And after that, I'm going to give an opportunity to those of you in the audience to ask questions. Not speeches, ask questions. If you want to ask questions, please put up your hand. And someone, when I recognize you, someone with a roving mic will come to you, and you'll have a chance to ask your question. There are some people who come to these events who like to grandstand and make speeches. We ask that you please don't do that. Because you are robbing other people of the chance to ask questions. We also ask that you, since our panelists have kindly revealed their identities and who they are, we ask you to match that and do the same. Say who you are and which institution it is you are representing tonight. So let's just talk about how we got here. I think you all know that there's been and is a price spike in fuel prices going on at the moment. These happen from time to time. And you all know probably that President Ramaphosa has called a special committee of ministers to look into addressing this issue because of the widespread concern and consternation, particularly amongst low-income groups. And perhaps he remembers that in 1993 there was a similar price spike, and the general civil unrest and uprisings that accompanied that are, in some people's opinion, or were the last nail in apartheid's coffin. Maybe he's thinking about that in the present situation. We don't want this to be the last nail in democracy's coffin. At about that time, SAPIA was established. And there's been a long debate. This is not a new question. Between 93 and 98, there was a lot of debate about this question of deregulation. And ultimately, it culminated in the White Paper on Energy Policy in 1998. And during that debate, organized business took a very robust view that deregulation was the thing to do. And government accepted that, and that is in the official government policy of the day, in the White Paper on Energy Policy. But it hasn't been implemented so far. For hard-pressed consumers, the real question is, will deregulation indeed lower petrol prices? So I'm now going to ask each of the panelists to give us their view on that question. And if I may, I'm going to sit here so I can interact with our panelists. And I'm going to ask Collins from the AA to kick off with his views.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks to everyone that has come through to this event. Maybe as a starting point from the Automobile Association, we welcome the opportunity and the platform for us to be able to expect and to extend our views on this very important topic. And we look forward to inputs from everyone. I don't believe that any one of us here in the panel has got all the solutions and the answers to the challenges that are facing us in this particular instance. We, from the Automobile Association, haven't taken a firm view as to whether the regulation or deregulation should take precedence. And I've got quite a number of few points that I'd like to make. And one of those points at this point relates to the fact that regulation provides transparency to the user. Now, the AA talks, or at least aims to represent the views of the road users. And therefore, that transparency in a regulated environment expresses or shows to the consumer how that price is actually being made up and what the implications are if there's any price increases. If there is no regulation, we believe that it would then leave the rest of the country to the vagaries of the market economy, where you might end up finding that people living in rural areas might not be able to get access to cheaper and affordable fuel, and so there'll be a significant skew in that particular situation. But on a broader note, from an AA perspective, we feel that the debate isn't about regulation. I think the bigger issue from an AA perspective is that the economy, because if you drop the price of the road accident fund, as an example, or the general levy, it will definitely lead to a deficit in terms of what government's collections are, which means it has to be funded in some form or the other. And therefore, if you then allow for that process to unfold, I think it will pose some interesting questions and challenges.
Thank you. So from the grassroots level of the motorists, let's switch to the other extreme, where let's get Ryan as an economist to give us an economist's perspective on this.
Sure. So I think the big thing to think about in this industry is the history and where it came from. So South Africa has had a regulated liquid fuels industry for many years now. And this was partly found its roots in apartheid and the protection of Sasol many years ago. For reasons that are not immediately clear to an economist at least, that situation has perpetuated itself. So we have quantitative import controls. We have an enormously complex regulatory regime that delivers extraordinary returns, particularly to the large oil refiners and marketers, and indeed further downstream as well. It's very hard to look at this industry and try and picture it without regulation, because it's hard to picture, and I think that's everybody's instinct, is to kind of sort of react and say, well, what's going to happen? We don't know. It's been regulated for 50 years. But I think that steps towards deregulation would have a massive impact. At the same time, that would need to take place with measures to introduce a lot more competition. And at the moment, what we see is a very highly concentrated market with a few very large players. And if you did not allow for greater competition at all of the various levels of the value chain, deregulation would indeed be a little bit risky. Having said that, it would be best to start with deregulation rather than wait for these barriers to entry to be entirely eliminated. And so in short, I would be in favor of deregulation. I think that would deliver benefits to consumers.
Let's hear from the industry perspective. Ron, what's SAPIA's view on this question?
This is quite a dividing question, Dr. Compton. I'm sure SAPIA members, if you ask them on their individual capacity, they will be very divided on this question. But we approach this topic from the global perspective. Will deregulation lower oil prices? Undoubtedly so. But then it all depends on some of the issues that they have just raised. There are potential outcomes that you need to expect if you want to deregulate the industry. Collins here, he talks about the impact that's going to be felt at the rural sites. So what is likely to happen is that you're going to have rationalization of the service station network. That's probably going to be the response. And it will also facilitate the entrance of new players. But let's look at the rationalization of service station network, what it will entail. You're going to have fewer service stations, but very competitive, especially in the urban area. Very competitive. And in remote areas like rural areas, you are likely to find that there is impact on local economy, because some of the service stations will cease to exist because of the competitive nature of the industry. You'll start to see a lot of sites, especially what we call unbranded sites, starting to take opportunity to fill the gap that has been left by the major players in those rural areas. And you will start to have issues relating to fuel quality in some of the service stations, because the competition is going to force people to think about other areas of making money. So even today in a regulated market, we do notice, or we are aware of people who are dumping products into service station. It will be worse if you are in a pure competitive market. And the offerings at the service stations is likely to decrease, especially the C-store that the way they are today, especially in areas where there's a low demand. So if you look at what happens in other parts of the world, you will start to see other players such as supermarkets. You know, there was an attempt even in South Africa many years ago by Pick n Pay to enter this industry. Once it deregulates, like what happens in Europe, you're going to start to see supermarkets and also wanting to participate, because it happens elsewhere in the world. And new players have got the potential to drive the prices down, particularly if they've got economies of scale, and expanding their offering not only to limit it to fuel. They've got the potential of reducing the price. But in the case of South Africa, since 1994, the new entrants have not really seriously affected the market structure. So even if we were to deregulate new players, they need to have economies of scale in order to really change and make sure that the competition is really felt and the benefit are passed on to the users. But you're going to see that on the highway sides, which is pretty much more like a captured market. If you have noticed the way the highway sites are designed, you are forced to use a particular highway if you are going to north or south direction. So in a way, I've got a captured market for that traffic. So when the market is really competitive, it means the service station that is there on the highway, which has got no competition because it's the only service station within that stretch, it can actually ask higher prices because it won't have a direct competitor as such. It's convenient for that particular route. And the price differential, it will be very evident. You're going to start to see, like in case of France, from what my colleague has put here, that they could see easily of service station in the same area, you've got a differential of 5 to 20 cents per liter. So when you go to supermarkets, it can go as high as 3 rand per liter, the difference from the branded sites. So assuming that self-service will disappear because it is one of the huge cost items, we're going to start to see impact on employment levels. Today we've got roughly, I would say, 100,000 forecourt attendants. That will be another area where if you want to reduce costs, you need to attack that. Another outcome is likely we're going to see it on the issue of HSSE, particularly what you see even in Europe, even today. There's a lot of fuel theft. What happened was self-service people, and then they just drive off without paying. So I can imagine in the case of South Africa, it will be theft. Because the other day,
What do you say about that?
Just a final point. The other day, my colleague was showing me a woman in a supermarket who have loaded all sorts of things called chicken, like formula for kids, and all sorts of stuff. So I can imagine on a product like fuel, if I drive off without paying, that's almost 1,000 rand in my pocket. So I think those are the opening remarks I would like to make.
Thank you, Frank. What are your views on this question?
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel. As already said by Prof, I've worked in the petroleum industry as well as been with the department for some time. And we're looking at this question. I think there was once a committee to look at the amelioration of this increase in prices. Then, if I recall, during the oil summit of 2008, there was this whole discussion whether to deregulate or not deregulate. And when we talk of deregulation, sometimes we quickly zoom to the regulation at the downstream end. And then we need to, when we talk of deregulation, to also consider the whole value chain. For example, if you look even the figures that are shown in terms of what NERSA is looking at, which is 41 cents, so to say, per liter, is that there are situations where you've got natural monopolies, like in the case of Transnet being the pipeline infrastructure, the logistics company, is that one would say that that would still need to be to have some form of regulation. My fellow panelist here, Mr. Chifraro, mentioned the issue of the petrol attendants, self-service vis-a-vis keeping those attendants. It's hardwired in legislation to keep those attendants in view of the job, the employment situation in the country. So all those things, we need to think about them and think about the fact that when we're talking of just a 1 cent increase, we're talking of an impact which is close to about 16 million rand based on the volumes that are being consumed in the whole market. So I would say that even the white paper on energy policy does look at deregulation, but then it has got 3 phases that it's looking at, and part of those things that are alluded in those phases are not necessarily achieved. But back to the question itself, I would say that my first response would be, I don't know, but in terms of being honest. But when one then looks at things, that when that question was raised a while ago, was that there was a chance that in the short term you would have a price decrease. And then the problem would be the issues now on the long term. And I think that as I'm speaking to you here, I've not had really a proper scientific study to look at that, to relook at that. So I think it's going to be important to relook at that so that we can also, I think we need also to be bold, Prof. When we make certain assumptions and make those decisions to say, let's go the route of deregulation, and we go through that. I remember we even had to say, let's change the terminology and not talk of deregulation to have market liberalization, so that we can gently move towards that. But in terms of having competition in the segments where it fits, and also I think one of the primary things that we need to deal with is also this thing of regulatory asymmetry. Because there is a lot of information that is not balanced in terms of the regulated entities vis-a-vis the ones that are regulating. To the extent that I've heard some people saying that the oil companies are creaming it. But if you go to the oil companies, they are big in poverty and all of that. So we need to be able to balance all those things. But I think that as a platform to engage, let's engage. And my last comment would be, may we please have sustained engagements in as far as this petroleum sector is concerned. Because come the high prices, we make a hula baloo around it, we talk a lot, and then when things start to settle down, the price goes down. I remember in 2008, before the crisis, the price was going $147.7 per barrel in terms of crude oil. And then there was this whole, discussions around it. And then I remember the day we had one of the summits, the price just went down. And it went down. So let's have sustained engagements and work on principles and not necessarily be moved because the price is moving up. Because if you've got a formula and the price moves up because you've got a formula, you must go change the formula and not necessarily go look at the price. Thank you.
So what I want to do is try and remove some of the baggage in the discussion so we can get to the real point. I'm going to ask some short questions, starting with you, Moon. This word deregulation, I know it became like privatization, like a swear word almost, but a lot of people think deregulation is like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. My question is to you as someone with regulatory experience. Is it possible it could also be like a rheostat, where you can turn the knob and the lights could be dim, turn it more, it could be brighter, turn it some more, it could be even brighter? Or is it like a light switch, it's either on or it's off? What's your view?
My view is that, my humble view is that this is not a on and off switch. As I said, that if one looks at the value chain and also one looks at the certain various aspects that makes up the price, even the price on alone, you can be able to talk of dimming the light and then strengthening the light instead of just on and off.
The next big question, which a lot of people misunderstand, and finally this is a question for you. In the slides that are circulating on the board behind us, the biggest chunk of the petrol price is the import parity price, so-called basic fuels price, which is governed by a formula, and we can argue about the formula, but underpinning it are two things, the oil price and the exchange rate. Tony, do you think South Africa can scale prices?
Look, I think we need to also appreciate that the BFP formula that is used to drive the import parity price is really very close to what will happen even in a deregulated market. I think it will be pretty much the same approach that the operators will follow as far as working out what should be the price. And if you were to temper, I see there's the biggest portion, which is really more like the benefit of the owners of oil rather than the oil companies. So if you were, because what it does, the import parity price, is basically gives you competitive, edge as far as protecting the margin that you are making, because it's a reflection of international product prices and the cost of laying substantial volumes in our ports. So if you were to tamper with that, in a way you are trying to advance the cost of lowering prices without following the true market parameters, you are likely going to trigger fuel shortages, because it will become uneconomic in order to land product in a deregulated market. So when you work on the basis of import parity, there are certain things that are beyond your control. The exchange rate, the dollar rand exchange rate, there's nothing you can do about it. It's what it is. The international product prices are dollar-based, so there's no way you're going to avoid that. Basically, all commodities, they work on the basis of the same principle of a dollar rand exchange. So that, there's nothing much you can do about it. But maybe you can zoom in to look at some of the elements within the import parity price to say, we have had this BFP since 2003. Before that, it was an IBLC. Just to look closely to say, is this still reflecting what is happening in the market? But on a principle basis, like what Mr. Mkize is saying, it's not to go there to say, I want to just make sure that I lower the price. You want to see if the formula is still achieving what you have set it to achieve. That becomes the answer. If it means it must go down, some of the parameters, they must be reduced, you do that because it's informed by principle. But if it says it must go up, then it goes up. Then you are principled in your approach.
So Ron, as an economist, do you agree with that view that if we have deregulated import prices, as a country we wouldn't be able to escape the oil price and the exchange rate? Whether we like it or not, we sort of stuck with that. Would you agree with that, or is there another way out for this economy?
I think that's absolutely true, of course, without a doubt. I think there are 2 points though. The first is that there is a way to avoid, for a lot of poor consumers, there is a way for public policy to ensure that these massive fluctuations in oil prices can be avoided through much better public transport that uses rail, for example, and electricity, rather than this absurd, old-fashioned taxi system that we have. So it isn't correct to say that we can't avoid it at all. There are absolutely ways to protect the poor a lot more than we currently are through real public transport. That's the first point. Then secondly, when it comes to the import parity price itself, I think the problem is the devil is in the detail, and allowing a deregulated market would allow us to actually check, well, is this BFT price that we have, which is completely artificial, by the way, currently. It's set according to a formula that picks a few markets in a few countries, and that's been analyzed, and there are lots of fights about the formula and so on, but it's absurd to have this static formula that guarantees a price for the oil companies without allowing markets to adjust and allowing markets to reflect what the actual import parity price would be, which is the economic approach.
So if you look at the petrol price build-up, about R5 of it is imposed by the Minister of Finance, and that's mainly made up of two big chunks. And Collins referred to the fuel levy, which is just a tax, goes into the general tax revenue along with tax on your salary every month. And Collins' view is really, if you're going to reduce that, then the Minister of Finance has to tax you somewhere else to compensate. So it's a seesaw. You can't have both ends up at the same time. And you can take your pick where to levy your tax, but there isn't really any way of avoiding it. I want to suggest that for the purpose of this discussion, let's park that item, because it's almost a non-negotiable. The second big chunk is the road accident fund. It's R1.93 of the price. Any newspapers has probably come to the opinion that it's a mess. And we could spend all night discussing how to fix that mess, although they've been trying for years, and there was a whole new act that was proposed, and there's third-party insurance which motorists could have. There are all these remedies, but I want to suggest for the purpose of this evening that we park that one as well, because it is a mess, and they've been trying for years to fix it, and they're failing to fix it. But can it be fixed? Well, I'll ask my panelists for a short yes or no on it. Could it be fixed? I mean, perhaps I don't even have to ask them. It's obviously it can be fixed. It just needs a bit of political will and dealing with that big industry called the legal profession to some extent. It can be dealt with somehow. So I think let's focus really on some of the other issues. And some of you have mentioned them. And I want to ask you for your comments, because as I mentioned, this is an old debate. It's not a new debate. There are people in this audience I can see who were in this debate in 1992, 1993, and who know all these arguments. And they're the ones smiling the biggest now, because the debate has really not moved on at all. And Muzi is quite right. If we're going to crack this debate, we should really take it seriously. I mean, it stuns me that people don't realize that the petrol, the money this economy spends on petrol, is almost the same as what it spends on electricity. There's such a fuss about electricity tariffs and Eskom and all these things, and nobody says boo about petrol price. It's extraordinary, but there we are, that's how it is. So I'm just going to run through these issues, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on ones which you would like to comment on, because these are the hoary old debates. The first one has been touched on. We must have competition to lead to have efficiency and lowest possible prices. That's the pro-argument. The counter-argument Fani touched on is if you take the light switch on or off approach, that will lead to forecourt attendants losing their jobs. It's interesting that as far as I know, the only job category in South Africa that is required by law is a forecourt attendant. You may not, by law, fill your own petrol. That job is guaranteed. So that's a thought which I'd like your comments on. If you agree with Muzi's view that this is more like a rheostat than an on-off switch, is there a way you could have deregulation and maintain jobs? That's the first one. The second one, of course, is the overpopulation of service stations in this economy. It's been around for donkey's years, and it's getting worse. The second argument is that the service stations are gold-plated. They're so beautiful, you can eat your breakfast off the floor. And the counter-argument is, oh, we must support small business. Never mind efficiencies in the economy, never mind prices, it's more important to support small business. So I please hear your views on it, because that's one of the debates. The other debate is that regulation is incentivizing inefficient behavior, inefficient investment. And you only have to look at the returns of the retail margin. It's a really good place to invest money compared to all the other slices of the sandwich. So it leads to inefficient resource allocation. This is the argument for deregulation. The counter-argument is that it's better to have flawed regulation and to protect those enterprises and to protect those people who are scooping the gravy in the mix. And then it gets more controversial. There's these companies called Sasol and Moskos, now Petrol. Were state-owned companies. They enjoyed protection, favorable allocations, and people out there saying, oh, payback time. Somehow we must extract some money from Sasol and Moskos to subsidize the petrol price. Any views on that one? The other favorite one is what's called locational advantage. Sasol plants and Natref refinery are inland and not at the coast, and therefore they have an unfair locational advantage relative to the Gauteng market, which is 60% of the market. What do you think? Is that true or not? And what should we do about that? And lastly, there's this question of anti-competitive practices by oil companies. Oil companies are swapping petrol. So it might have been manufactured by Shell, but it's sold at Total, BP's petrol station. The same molecule. And they're swapping product, and somehow this is anti-competitive, and therefore we should, I don't know what the word is, but we should address the oil companies about this. I'm just giving you the arguments that are floating out there in the public, not expressing my personal point of view. I'm trying to just isolate what have been the main arguments in the past and to get the panel's comments on any of these arguments you want to comment on. You don't have to comment on all of them, but some you might want to comment on. So let's maybe comment. You want to kick off?
Maybe, Prof, let me start by the earlier point you asked with regards to can you have an impact on the rand-dollar exchange rate or even the dollar pricing of oil. I think at the dollar pricing level there's very little that one can do. But at the rand-dollar exchange rate, for me, goes to how the macroeconomics of the country are being managed. Because if the country is properly managed and everything is done properly, then you wouldn't have the massive impact that you're having with regards to the rand-dollar exchange rate. Yes, bar those instances where there is what I would call emerging markets contagion or issues. And in those instances, obviously, there's a general view and an impact in terms of the price of the rand-dollar exchange rate. But beyond that, I still think that I would hate to externalize all the issues and not look inward and say, what is it that we can do as a country and an economy to manage our resources efficiently and effectively to make sure that the impact of whatever the changes in the pricing is actually being mitigated by proper resource allocation and across the board. So I think that's the first part I wanted to raise. Then the issue around competition. From an perspective, and we've looked at this, that's why we have almost felt that we would want to participate in this forum, so that we can get the views of the general public and everyone else in terms of whether should you deregulate or regulate. But fundamentally, the government, and I think since maybe the early 2000s or to mid-2000s, have used the fuel levy as a general levy to cough up its resources in terms of being able to fund the expenditure that they needed to do for other things. So the fuel levy was no longer focusing on just providing the roads or providing this or providing, it was used as a general tax. And fortunately or unfortunately, at this point in time, fuel tax collection is the most efficient tax collection that is available at the moment, which is also widely dispersed, which then means that for anyone, if I run a business and I find that my collection mechanism is much more efficient, most likely want to stick to that collection mechanism. If you go to any other collection mechanism, and one can go through examples around, for example, the tolls, where the collection cost was about 50% of the revenue, rather than looking and saying, how can you effectively and efficiently collect the revenue. So I just wanted to contribute and raise those points. Over-concentration, I think, as an organization that looks after the road user, I think fundamentally we want to see this thing in its broader context. Yes, there's impact on jobs. The question is, what is the country's responsibility to those people, those 100,000 people that are out there? Is there a responsibility? What does it mean? If you go through the price that is depicted there, it's only what, in fact, less than 20 cents that actually goes towards the margins in the forecourt. So isn't that much of a big issue that will have an impact on 200,000 or 100,000 jobs and maybe 400,000 people that are depending on those people? And I think those are fundamental questions that I would want us as a society to begin to look at and consider, because the government is looking at all of those things. I mean, one of the biggest cost pressures from a government perspective is the ballooning of social of SASSA grants. And what does it mean? And how do you then collect and make sure that those things? And to look at them in isolation, I think is problematic. The inefficient resource allocation, it's I think it's, at this point in time, if you look at the way state-owned enterprises, the whole of government is being managed, I think it is my view and also our view that there can be better allocation of resources without burdening the men in the street. And therefore, some form of regulation also causes a problem. And if I know that my over-expenditure problem can be solved by raising a VAT by another 1 percentage point next year, what incentive do I have to make sure that I manage that? But I think those are my comments.
Thank you, Collins. Colin, should we go to this?
Yes, I'm glad you raised the issue of anti-competitive behaviors. I mean, it's unfortunate that a lot of these things, they don't get published very well. I mean, on the 19th of January, 2009, the Competition Commission announced an investigation into pretty much the oil industry. To address some of the concerns that you are raising, that there is some anti-competitive behavior and everything. And I'm glad to report that this year that investigation has been completed and the Competition Commission will not find any evidence of anti-competitive behavior in the oil industry.
Maybe you should just say that again, a little bit louder.
So all I'm saying is that there is evidence that we are not anti-competitive. Particularly, I can talk on behalf of SAPIA members because they were subject to this investigation. So actually, we would like to encourage anybody who's got evidence that there's some anti-competitive behavior to report it to the Competition Commission. They will gladly investigate because I think that needs to be cleared. And the issue of product swap or exchanges, it is a global practice for a good reason. And it's pro-competition, if you think about it. It has benefits that are accrued basically to the use of the product. Because if you think about it, a refinery is quite an expensive equipment. So you really need to build. I mean, talking about the refinery building these days, I mean, people they are talking about 100 billion rand just to set up a refinery. So that is not like I'm talking about 360,000, 400,000 barrels of refinery. So you can imagine in a country as small as South Africa, even though we like to believe that we are very big, but if we were to have refinery like in all regions, that would be very expensive, for the whole industry. But the way it works is that, all companies, they help each other, either by selling to each other in a particular region where they are not present, because it just makes business sense that, instead of Sabref shipping the product all the way to Cape Town, in Durban to Cape Town, they can buy from Chevron in Cape Town. So it just makes a lot of sense. They cut a lot of other costs. So I think I see benefits in that. If you also think about the whole issue of product exchanges, you can only do it if you all believe in the quality of your competitor. So once you introduce deregulation, if you are not so sure of what you're going to get from a competitor, that can also be threatened. So that benefits that today is really accrued to the motorist, it might as well disappear. So I thought also maybe I can touch on the issue of location advantage, because petroleum products are international commodities. A very good example is products that are manufactured in South Africa can be sold anywhere else in the world, but at an international prevailing price. So it does not make sense to expect that a product that is manufactured by a South African company, that it should somehow, because of some reasoning, that it should be cheaper than product that will be produced in any other part of the world. Yet it's the same product that can be used anywhere else in the world. So I would like to believe that we should have a single price, which is an international price, irrespective of where you are producing that product. So that becomes the prevailing product price, because it's for everybody, it's not for a company, it's for everybody. Because our pricing structure works on the basis of zone. So whether I've got a facility in zone A or not, but the price that I will pay, it will be for zone 1A, which is would be the coastal price. So that is how I would like to view the issue of location advantage.
Well, while you're checking on this, let's ask Ryan, as an economist, and this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but Ryan, is geography real in economics? When it comes to setting prices of competitors who are different distances from the market, is geography a legitimate consideration in markets, unregulated markets determining prices?
Of course it is a consideration. It depends on what the marginal source of supply is and how these swapping arrangements work in the end. If the product isn't in fact being shipped, then it depends on bargaining power, of course, between the suppliers. So you could get very low prices inland if a coastal supplier was able to bargain for that low price. So
and could market forces do this kind of bargain, or does it require the heavy hand of the state to grab them by the scruff of the neck and say, bargain?
Well, at the moment, so this is partly an issue. This came up in quite a lot of detail. There's a lot of debates about this, the Sasol engine merger some years ago, and that to some extent depends on their relative sizes. In South Africa, at least at the time, the oil majors were similarly sized. Okay, some like Engen were a lot bigger on the retail side, and Sasol was a lot smaller on the retail side. And so it depends. The real issue though is that if you've got enough competition, if you've got enough competing wholesale providers, then this kind of issue falls away. That's linked as well, and you won't have this answer, but that's linked. It's that it's this natural monopoly, and we could never have competing pipeline providers. If we allow competing pipeline providers, then you would reduce those geographic discrepancies substantially.
Muzi, maybe you want to come in on, do you know the history? There was a pipeline that was going to be built from Maputo to Gauteng by the private sector to compete with Transnet's pipeline. Transnet's pipeline started out at 9 billion. Last I heard it was north of 30 billion. So isn't there a market for a competing pipeline to come into the inland market, maybe from Mozambique, from Maputo, for example?
Therefore, I could say that there is that potential, granted. But when one just looks at the country, I think the biggest challenge that we have, because when we're talking of regulation of the equipment, we must also factor in the issue of import and export control, where if you're talking of competition, you also have to open the space in terms of that. Prior to the review of the guidelines, there was this protectionist approach of the previous regime, but then it kind of opened up after the shortages of 2005, and to just open up for people to also be able to import product into the country, because you can say that you want to deregulate the space, but it's still going to stay the same because there are only those few players that have got access to infrastructure. So the challenge is access to that particular to the import infrastructure, especially back on the port infrastructure, to bring product in and then be able to ship that in there. In terms of the capacity of the pipeline, I think that the capacity of the multi-product pipeline, granted it has delayed, there's been a lot of problems around it, which is a matter that we are looking at, and it's being regulated mainly from NESA side in terms of the tariffs. I think that there is enough capacity. Actually, they can still put other pump stations if capacity increases. So there isn't really room for a competing pipeline in terms of the economy of, I would say, efficient investments around it. When one looks at the NMPP as it stands today.
So there's a big question in there about state-owned enterprises making inefficient investments, and if competition forced them out of the market, taxpayers would be lumbered with that debt. Something to think about. I'm coming to the audience soon for questions, so start thinking of your questions. But I want to put two more questions to Muzi. From your understanding, I mean, one of the phenomena we have now, which hasn't been around for a long time, is we have Puma entering this market and performing a classic encirclement movement around the major metropoles and bringing in competition, backed by a big trader. Isn't that really the best possible time to deregulate, to deal with Ryan's point about competition, and you need some maverick players in the market who can really compete? That's the one question. The other question is, from your understanding, what is the rationale in the Department of Energy for regulating petrol prices? The theoretical rationale is that there must be market failure, and when you demonstrate market failure, you've got a justification for regulation. So if you drive onto any forecourt in South Africa, you'll find diesel at an unregulated price, and on the pump next door, you'll find petrol at a regulated price. So what is the market failure that petrol suffers from that diesel doesn't suffer from? If you know, many of us don't know, but maybe you could share your understanding of what government's thinking is of this market failure that apparently exists.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe starting with the latter question, I'm no longer a government employee, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I'm just going to talk in terms of my understanding as things stand. Diesel, by and large, is seen as a commercial fuel. Used for commercial purposes, and petrol really was used for personal travel, etc. So there is this challenge that also came up, the challenge of that you had a passive regulation of diesel, where there is still a price that is being given as indicative, and then there's then some competition. But we've seen also these vehicles coming to the fore aggressively, and more and more people moving towards diesel, and also being deemed seen as an efficient fuel. So there is that move. But when it comes to petrol, the other challenge, it talks to the issues of location, because now it's and these are some things that need to be looked at. Because in this city, you are going to have competition, and there could be some of the service stations that fall by the wayside. And by the way, the amendment of the Petrol Products Act, I don't think that it has yielded what was also envisaged in terms of moving from what used to be called the red plan to the dispensation of the Petrol Products Act, which was going to see some of the service stations that are run inefficiently to going under and getting rid of those. But I'll just say that for my side, there's an issue that you have areas where it's difficult for you to get your car filled because it's not economical advantage, especially the outlying areas for this service station. So it was also that, remember the other challenge that I think the reality speak to it, that you see sometimes it becomes very difficult to envisage a future when you have not had some experience of it. Because we were moving from the time when the country was facing, was under siege and with the oil embargoes, and really this was a strategic economy, like a commodity, to ensure that the country still keeps running. Because we talk of a shutdown causing about, I think in figures of 2005, it was about 1 billion that will suffer every day. So I'm saying that there are these considerations in terms of the role that is played by fuel in the economy to make sure that the economy still keeps running, and hence the need then to come in and regulate. Also noting that all the refineries that are in place, even the whole setup is around agreements that have been set also with government playing a role in assisting these players. But then, back to the other question that you asked was about the people like Puma coming in. I would say that there is room actually for I think really consideration must be made of in terms of the phasing of this deregulation, looking from the service station end, maybe going back to say how possible that could be done, because that phenomenon is also helping in terms of bringing some competition and a new way of thinking, you know. Because with service station, for example, we even look at the benchmark service station to try to remove all the rules and verses, so the rules and verses on the service station, so that we can have one that is economic and efficient. But there are still challenges with that. Again, the issues of regulatory asymmetry that come in, so that even now there's a battle between the retailers and the oil companies in terms of how that margin is shared, which is also something that is before the courts. I don't want to go much on those. But for me, there is room really to look at that in terms of how we slowly phase in deregulation, the so-called market liberalization, if I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. So, are there any questions? Okay, if I could just remind you, put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Someone will, when I recognize you, someone will come with a mic, and we'll take a first round, and this time we'll take another. So I can see a gentleman there with his hand, number one, and there's Mr. Gomeni, number two, and two gentlemen at the back who will try to pick off the mic, one just in front of the other. So let's start with number one, those the first four. The one was the gentleman sort of towards the back.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Christopher from Teardrop Media. I just want to check on the issue that was raised in terms of deregulation and maintenance of jobs. And some say it's basically, you know, your artificial intelligence. We're now moving into robotics. How can we blend those issues together?
Is your question directed at anyone in particular?
Not anyone in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, my name is Tata Kumege, and I've got two questions for the panelists. The first one is, so do you think that the cross-subsidy between rural and urban areas, rural consumers, is still necessary? Don't you think that if we were to deregulate, we'd end up with rural consumers ending up driving some 50 kilometers to put on 200 rands worth of fuel. To Ryan, do you think that opening up the industry to full imports would not result in serious job losses? I'm not talking about retail, I'm talking about in the manufacturing side of the business, and put energy security at risk.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back, Peter Morgan, I think it was, and then the gentleman behind him. And please, let's not try to emulate Mr. Gomez's clever move to get 2 questions for the price of 1.
I think then I'll take Mr. Gomez's first question as one of mine as well, and I'll just use one. I have a question for the panel, and a comment that says I'm actually quite disappointed that the whole issue of transformation and the importance that we have in our country at the moment, and how poor we've been in this industry, that it hasn't become a focus of our discussions tonight. I'd like to ask the panel their opinion on what would happen to transformation in this industry if we deregulated in the next year or 2.
Thank you. That's the way to do it. Short, sharp, sweet.
Thanks. My name is Rolf Hanfield-Jones from Diamonds.co.za. A question for Ryan. With Sasol, as we have it, is there not an argument to be made that if we deregulate, Sasol, with its lower production costs and the fact that it doesn't have input costs like wharfage and transport across the seas and so on, could then seize the monopoly and dominate the industry to the extent that it could put the rest of the oil companies out of business? Do you think that's a possibility? And if so, what do you think some of the pros and cons are?
Thank you. I think let's give the panel a crack at that, and then we'll come to another round. General questions. Any you want to tackle?
Yeah. Look, I think the point was made. Maybe I'm just referring to your question that you asked about robotics and AI. The state of the South African economy at this point in time, and if you look at overseas markets, there has been a sort of leeway being given to set the station to allow for people to do their own things without using any forms of technology. But in South Africa, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side of the spectrum you sit, the government has actually regulated that there should be a petrol attendant to help you to do the work of pouring the petrol. Now, that for me is more of a social question rather than a practical question in terms of economics. From an economics or from a financial perspective, it obviously would make sense for the industry to be allowed to make sure that they find efficient ways in which people can be able to fill up in terms of their petrol. But that also, to a certain extent, almost ignores a massive coming up trend around electricity and electric vehicles. Because with electricity and electric vehicles, you actually don't need anyone to pour petrol for you. And you just plug it in onto the wall, and the car charges itself. So I would see it at this point in time almost as an interim measure, up until a significant portion of the vehicles becomes electric vehicles that the need for regulating and actually having people to pour petrol is going to be obsolete, but that would be a timing issue rather than the regulation issue.
Thank you. Tony,
I think I'll have a go at the cross-subsidy question between urban and rural sites. I think in the current dispensation, it is necessary. I'm talking now during the current regulation that we have, because if we don't do that, definitely you're going to start to see that rural people will suffer. I think Moses alluded to that. You'll find that they will have to drive a longer distance to get fuel, because there won't be margin like protection that recognize that there are rural sites that are not able to pump big volumes like the urban one. So for the current setup, I think it's still necessary. However, if we as a country took a decision that we want to deregulate the industry, we need to look specifically at that question to say, like, what is going to happen to rural sites? I mean, what is going to happen to the issue of access to petroleum products by people in rural areas? We should have answers for those questions, because the likely impact is that, I mean, most of them, they're going to shut down, and those that will remain open, because it will be free for all, the prices are going to be very high. So many years ago, I was reading, I mean, something along these lines. I think there's a big concern even in Europe, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, I think in Wales. I mean, that was when I was reading about the sustainability of rural businesses. Not only the petroleum industry, whether you're talking about the post office in rural areas, talking about a butchery, all those kind of businesses, to say like, how do we get to support them? How do we make them sustainable? So you should think about mechanisms, support packages, like how do we support service stations that are going to be vulnerable due to a change in policy direction, so that the rural people don't have to suffer suddenly, they have to drive 100 kilometers to get fuel. So you need to have a package that will respond to those people, whether it's like some sort of financial support mechanism, assistance, that recognize that, I mean, rural people are now disadvantaged. I think transformation, it can still happen in a deregulated industry where there's no deregulation. You just need to know that transformation is driven through the BE Act, which is like TTI administered act. We've got many examples of industries where there's no regulation, where there's still transformation. Good example, I can give you a construction sector. Nobody regulates the construction sector in terms of economic regulation. All you need is a license, but there's still transformation that's happening there. I mean, you can mention about property sector. There's no regulation in terms of what rent can you charge your tenants, but there's still concerted effort to drive transformation, either through their charter or any other agreement that will have been in place with the line minister. So deregulation could not be a threat to transformation. It can still happen even when you're deregulated.
Thank you. Was there any comments before we go on to Ryan's question?
Okay, thanks. And I think let me just take off from the last response. From my side, I think that if you're looking at regulation as just retail price regulation, that may be what Mr. Shifrada is alluding to will be the case. But for transformation, really, there should be a form of regulation to assist in that. I'm saying that because sometimes it's not a question of the hardwired infrastructure, it's a question of business rules that seek then to eliminate other people, making it difficult to operate. As I said, that we're still grappling with the issue of uncommitted capacity, where people want to import and be able to use to have access to the infrastructure, which will of itself be problematic. We've got this industry and other things, so I just want to also touch on the issue of competition. Is that the industry there's one issue of anti-competitive behavior that was alluded to earlier on, but there is also the issue of engaging with the industry, where the industry gets designated by the Minister of Trade and Industry, so that there can be those discussions that sometimes outside people may view them as anti-competitive, whereas because of the nature of our market, we're able to still engage with the designation that has been granted by the Minister. But to the issue of cross-subsidization between rural and urban, yes, it is going to become a problem, like I alluded to earlier on. But if these things are happening, it means you must also tweak elsewhere to be able to deal with that problem. But it's going to be, as I said earlier on, I highlighted it as one of the problems that are going to take place, to occur, if we're talking of a deregulated market. Then the issue of robotics, I would say that I think that we need to, maybe the issue of in the energy sector, the issue of institutional rearrangement need to be considered, so that there is also better focus on some of the issues. And I'm happy that when I look at what is happening in the department and in the space, that there's now more debate, more engagement on some of these issues. Like, I mean, they've resuscitated this kind of engagement. And I think that the issue of transitions, where we want to get to, and then start to work now to get where we want to be when it comes to the issues of robotics. Because we don't want to wake up one day and say, no, let's scrap this thing of having petrol attendants. But we need to say, where are things going? But some of the things are not within our control. If you've got electric vehicles, for example, coming in sometime down the path, we need to prepare for that and have a proper path going in that direction. So, yeah, I think for me that would be, because I think the others were left out for real trust.
Before we speak about, I think what's emerging very clearly is that the history of our country has given us this petrol price, which has got, it's like a rope with many twines that have been interwoven in it. There's bits of industrial policy, there's bits of social policy, bits of cross-subsidy, bits of urban redevelopment, and a whole mishmash of things has got twined together into this one thing which now becomes the debate around the petrol price. But Ryan,
sorry, maybe give it before Ryan comes in. That's to complete on the issue of the rural and urban. You know, when I was in Malam, we were looking at revitalizing one of the tourist attraction areas, Pilgrim's Rest. And then, just because the service station there was not working, we find that was actually contributing very negatively in terms of attracting tourists. So this issue of availability of fuel has got a larger, bigger impact in terms of the economic development and the local economic development, especially for a country with a dire need for rural economic development. Thank you.
I would say, just to tackle the most difficult thing first, around jobs. Firstly, I'm a bit conflicted because somebody in my household is employed at a petrol station, so it feels like a very personal kind of question. I would say that it's tied up to a wider problem in our economy, and that is skills generally. And I think that this refusal to deal with skills head on and instead keep all these bizarre kind of regulatory structures around, like in the petrol industry, but this is in lots and lots of other sectors, like the overemployment of Eskom and many, many others. I think it's the wrong approach. I think skills need to be tackled head on. Having said that, if there's going to be big adjustments in the sector, then people need to be protected, including the person in my household. So, and then just secondly, regarding the question about Sasol and won't we get a monopoly then in land, I mean, I'm not 100% sure what the answer to that question is. I will say this, that Sasol has constraints in terms of its capacity. There's only a finite amount of natural gas that's being imported from Mozambique to convert to liquid fuels. And my understanding from what they report in the press at least is that coal, that they don't intend to expand any more coal to liquids capacity. So that means that deregulation would not result in this massive problematic monopoly. And just finally on that point, remember that Sasol will still need liquid fuels at the coast, so they'll still need to swap some of that capacity with the coastal importers. And so their market power would be constrained to some extent, and ultimately their market power would be constrained by imports, including imports inland. Again, provided that, as Vusi pointed out, that capacity is provided to third parties, including, incidentally, new black entrants. And I think that this is a major problem. Colleagues of mine at the University of Johannesburg, sorry Raj, have written a paper on this, and there are substantial barriers to new black entrants. And I know that NERSA is dealing with this uncommitted capacity issue, but more can and should be done on that front.
What do you mean? Other universities also write papers?
This rural to urban, so this urban to rural subsidy question, I find it very puzzling. On the one hand, we're all concerned about prices going up in rural areas. On the other hand, the petrol stations are going to close down. I mean, which is it? You know, I think that the market should be allowed to play itself out in this particular area. I would also say, and I know that I have an urban bias because I live here in Johannesburg, but I would also say that South Africa is going to move towards other developed countries and other developing countries like Brazil, where most people, quite frankly, are living in urban areas. And so the sort of continuous anxiety about rural areas, I think, is sometimes a little bit overemphasized.
I think it does raise the issue that there's a lot of legitimate social needs in South Africa. I don't think any of us will dispute them. The question is the petrol price the correct instrument to address those kind of social needs? You know, that's really, to me, the question. So anyway, we're on to another round. Oh, it's warming up a lot. We start here, and then this gentleman is right here, and then the gentleman with the cap, and then the gentleman whose hand is very high. In case I'm accused of being left-oriented, I'll look to the right as well. Thank you, lady. That was in the next round.
Thank you. Thank you, Rod. I'm Cliff Cardolli of Fuels Industry Consultant in one of the issues with the regulation that hasn't been touched on is that, of course, the largest section of the service stations in this country are owned or controlled by what? It's about a 60-40 split in our own. So direct, 60% are controlled or owned by the oil companies and 40% are private. Now, with deregulation, you're going to have the loss of jobs if self-service becomes one of the legs of regulation that falls. You have cheaper pump prices, hopefully because of the loss of saving of the margin. But the third leg in regulation is vertical integration. And I think that numbers of service stations will close, but certainly the ones that are owned or controlled by the oil companies will not close. And in fact, what may happen is that the oil companies will simply remove those retailers and appoint managers.
Are we getting to the question?
That's the question. What does the panel think about the fact that it's not only the loss of jobs, the loss of retailers, retail sites, but also the loss of the control and giving the oil companies even more control?
Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you for an insightful conversation. My question is maybe to Mosi and Ryan. So how do countries manage to fuel at a cheaper price than South Africa? And maybe Ryan, so what would deregulation in South Africa mean for neighboring economies who rely on product supplies from South Africa as well? I'm Zweli.
Thank you. Was the other gentleman there?
Hi everyone, my name is Thabo Serame. I'd just like to also go a bit deeper into the technology side. And my take is, what's your sort of take on the role of technology, right? The distribution side of fuel in the future. Meaning, do you guys think that there would be an elimination of the fuel service station itself, and there could be another type of distribution channel? What's your take on it?
You might be interested to know there's a petrol station not far from here which advertises that they will deliver to you and fill up your car wherever you happen to have your car. So, no. So that's already happening. It was the lady over there. Yes.
My name is Nekanda.
Well, a big voice, please.
My name is Nekanda Mobutela. So I have a question around fossil fuel subsidization. So it is an issue that is gaining a lot of momentum within the global space, particularly within climate change, as well as energy transition. So I'm just curious, to what extent does the topic of subsidization intersect with deregulation? or regulation for that matter in terms of pricing.
Okay, thank you. Right, panelists. Full company ownership, vertical integration. Ronnie, maybe you should have a crack at that one.
I thought it was for that.
No, I think it's just for the panel.
Okay.
It was for the panel.
Yeah, but I mean, but look, if we look at the European experience, because we look at that when we prepare for this, even oil companies start to do those. Because what then happened, the focus moves towards efficiency, supporting those service stations that are big purpose. And you'll see the ones that they feel that, they are not worth supporting, they will let them go. And that's where other people will see opportunity. And that is where price will come into the picture in terms of competition. Because you'll see that, what then happens is that even oil companies themselves, they will start to compete very directly with supermarkets, because supermarkets will come with a different strategy, because they are not only focusing at selling fuel. They are looking at so many other products and lines within their shop. So they will use fuel just to attract customers instead of so many other things. So the experience is that even oil companies themselves, they will start to rationalize. In urban centers, they will choose which service station they need to focus on, and the one that they are prepared to let go. Because, oil company will choose in terms of the structure they want to do, even though we'll see a lot of job losses, they might choose to maintain a leaner sort of structure where it's about people giving support, but at a much bigger scale, and I'm talking about in terms of the site itself, to be pumping much higher volumes in order to do something like that. So it all depends on the regulatory framework. If the law still maintains that if you own service station, you cannot also be an operator, you are not going to be able to just appoint your people. You still have to go through the normal procedure that we have today. But if it's going to be only regulation of fuel quality and making sure that you follow proper business practice and everything else is open and is left to the market, yes, that probably might be another option for people to look at, how can we reduce the cost and increase the margin that we can extract from this business.
Thank you. Ryan, and Lucy, on the neighbouring countries question?
Okay, all right, I'll go first. With regard to neighboring countries, I think as the price was being flashed over here, I think it gives a clear indication that because of the tax element of our fuel, then it comes up more expensive than the neighbors. But that goes to the meritorious work that the government is trusted in.
On that one, there's a site on the web where you can get all the petrol prices in the world in a graph, and they go from very low to very high, and tax makes a big difference. That's one of the other. And what impact would deregulation have on prices in neighbouring countries?
I don't think that price would be negatively impacted, but because they must work on a markup on our price. Obviously, if our price as a result of the regulation goes up, then theirs will also go up accordingly. Except if they find other channels of bringing in product, like we've seen happening in a country like Botswana. And then when it comes to the issue of the vertical integration, legislation tried to deal with the issue of vertical integration, where it was saying that any scheme that renders a wholesaler tantamount to being a retailer is unlawful. But we had a lot of challenges with the way that was crafted. And obviously, because of the backing of the oil industry, the so-called products, the company-owned, dealer-operated side will stand a better chance in terms of survival in where the market vagaries are
quite tough.
Ron, your views on that?
I would just say that from an economics perspective, vertical integration is almost always, or is usually pro-competitive and efficient. So there's a concept that we use called double marginalization, and the essence of it is that you've got big firms upstream, they make a markup. You've also got, and then if you introduce a firm with market power, with some market power downstream as well, that also has a markup, you actually have two margins. There's a double margin there, and actually prices in those circumstances are higher than if you had a single vertically integrated entity. And so actually from an economics perspective, vertical integration may be very, very good from a pricing perspective.
Yeah. Then there's Tabo's question about technology and the fossil fuel question. Colin, do you want to take it?
Yeah, look, I mean, the distribution of fuel, unfortunately, not so sure lends itself that much to technology. But I think some of the factors that we haven't raised in the discussion today, in my mind, relate to what is the role of substitution. And I'm talking electric vehicles. Because if you go into rural areas and there's a rationalization of service stations, for those particular markets, it becomes much more viable for them to then go for electric vehicles and use them as a substitute. And I just think that the reaction of the market to those issues, I think, is quite interesting. Then the other element that I would like to raise is the rationalization of stations in the major metropolitan areas. I needed to address this question, is that though there's over-concentration at this point in time, you're sitting in a situation where the way the consumer today is consuming things, is not consuming petrol, is not consuming this. With all the loyalty programs that are out there, there is going to be a massive impact in terms of who then becomes the distributor of certain services and the impact on accessibility of those services to the general public. And I think that in its own will swing this whole thing in a completely different direction. What the impact would be, I think it's something that I'm not so sure about. Then in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, in the United States, and I think when the oil price was going up quite significantly in the region of $135 dollars per barrel and stuff like that, we started getting a lot of investments coming through. And I think what happened is your oil companies, and I'm talking now your Gulf countries, realized that if the price of fuel remains at those high prices or at high rates, it was making it feasible and viable for people to invest in other alternative technologies. And that had a massive impact in terms of the decisions to then cut or increase production so that you can drop the price and have a completely different impact. So I think at any given point in time, all of these different variables will be will depend on how does the market respond to those factors, and then be able to come up with alternatives that will then drive the prices in a different direction.
But I think one should clarify, as far as I know, there are no subsidies to consuming oil products in South Africa. And maybe in other countries, in fact, the Middle East, they're very prolific. And they have been in the past in Zimbabwe and Nigeria. But it's a slippery slope. So as far as I know, there aren't any direct subsidies. There may be cross-subsidies of an urban, rural nature and so on, but no direct subsidies. And it wouldn't make economic sense. I mean, dollar-denominated products are a scarce commodity. You should try and make them as expensive as possible to discourage their consumption, on the one hand. A last comment. The electric vehicle idea, early on we established that so long as we're dependent on oil, we're stuck with the international oil price and the exchange rate. But electric vehicles can remove you from that equation. You get South African sunshine for free. You just need to manufacture the panels, generate the electricity, and so from a policy point of view, at broad level, that looks very attractive. You know, the thing that would govern it would be the cost of batteries, converting sunshine into electricity. Whether that cost is coming down significantly all the time. So I know my colleagues from the oil industry don't want to hear this, but in this fourth industrial revolution, anything goes. All sorts of things are happening. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry, but we have come to the point where we have to draw a line in the sand because our generous sponsors have arranged, the AA have arranged some snacks and drinks for you outside, and we wouldn't want fruitless and wasteless expenditure. So I'm going to thank our visitors, our panelists, with a little token of this appreciation for their effort. Thank you very much. And I'm sure what I'm doing is giving them a round of applause. Out the door to the left is where you'll find some refreshments. Thank you very much for attending.
Yes,